In the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the Colorado high country meets the vast New Mexico wilderness, there existed a truth so profound that it would shake the very foundations of what we believed about the American frontier. What happened at sunset on that October evening in 1887 would remain hidden for over a century, buried beneath layers of government documents and Apache oral tradition, until one discovery changed everything we thought we knew about the West. The first hook comes in the form of Joseph Running Bear, a man caught between two worlds. Born to a white settler father and Apache mother in the territorial days of New Mexico, Joseph had spent his adult life as a tracker for the U.S. Army, hunting down renegade Apache bands that refused to surrender to reservation life. But on this particular evening, as golden light painted the Sandia Mountains in brilliant amber, Joseph would discover that some hunts lead the hunter to truths they never intended to find. The second hook reveals itself in the mountain itself. For decades, the Apache had whispered of Ziln Ka Sian, the mountain that sits up, a sacred peak in the Cibola National Forest where the spirits of their ancestors were said to dwell. But what Joseph discovered that evening wasn't spiritual at all. It was something far more tangible, far more dangerous, and far more valuable than anyone could have imagined. Our story begins 3 days before the revelation, in the dusty settlement of Espanola, where Joseph received orders from Colonel Marcus Thompson at Fort Union. Apache raiding parties had been spotted moving through the Rio Grande Valley, hitting isolated homesteads and disappearing into the labyrinth of canyons that carved up the landscape like ancient scars. The territorial governor was demanding action, and Joseph's reputation as the finest tracker in the New Mexico territory made him the obvious choice for what everyone expected would be a routine pursuit. Joseph examined the evidence at the Henderson Ranch, where the Apache had struck 2 nights prior. The family had survived, barricaded in their root cellar while the raiders took horses and supplies. But something about the raid pattern troubled him deeply. These weren't the desperate acts of starving reservation jumpers he'd tracked before. The footprints told a different story, one of organization, purpose, and most unsettling of all, restraint. The Apache could have easily overrun the homestead, but they'd taken only what they needed and left no casualties behind. Following the trail northward through the Espanola Valley, Joseph noted how the Apache had moved with unusual care to avoid populated areas. They'd bypassed several easy targets, including a supply wagon that had been traveling alone on the Santa Fe Trail. Instead, their path led consistently toward the Sangre de Cristo Range, toward peaks that rose like ancient sentinels against the endless New Mexico sky. As the afternoon of the third day began to fade, Joseph found himself climbing through pine forests that seemed to whisper secrets in languages older than memory. The Apache Trail led him to a ridge overlooking a hidden valley, a place the maps called simply Canyon Perdido, the Lost Canyon. But as Joseph studied the terrain through his field glasses, he realized this wasn't lost at all. Smoke rose from what appeared to be a permanent settlement, with cultivated fields and livestock pens that spoke of months, perhaps years of habitation. This wasn't a raiding camp. It was a thriving community hidden in one of the most inaccessible regions of the territory. As sunset approached, painting the western peaks in shades of crimson and gold, Joseph made his way down into the canyon using deer trails that seemed to have been deliberately concealed from casual observation. The Apache had chosen their refuge well, surrounded by walls of red sandstone that rose nearly vertical for hundreds of feet, accessible only through narrow passages that could be easily defended. But as he drew closer to the settlement, Joseph began to notice details that made no sense for an Apache camp. The buildings weren't traditional Apache wickiups or even the adobe structures common to the region. Instead, he observed wooden structures that seemed almost European in design, with glass windows that reflected the dying light and stone chimneys that spoke of permanent habitation through harsh mountain winters. Garden plots were laid out in geometric patterns that suggested formal agricultural knowledge, and the livestock included breeds that would have been impossible for Apache raiders to acquire from local ranches. It was then, as the sun balanced on the rim of the western mountains, that Joseph saw him. Standing on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the entire settlement was a figure unlike any Apache warrior he'd ever encountered. The man was tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, with long gray hair that caught the evening breeze and clothing that seemed to combine Apache traditional dress with elements Joseph couldn't identify. But it wasn't the man's appearance that froze Joseph in place behind his concealment of juniper and pinyon pine. It was the fact that the figure was clearly aware of his presence and had been waiting for him. The Apache raised one hand in what could have been either greeting or warning, and Joseph realized that every step of his 3-day pursuit had been anticipated, perhaps even guided. The raiders hadn't been fleeing military justice, they'd been leading him here, to this moment, to this revelation that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the relationship between his two peoples. As full darkness began to claim the canyon, torches blazed to life throughout the settlement below, revealing a level of organization and prosperity that defied every assumption about Apache life in the territorial period. Joseph counted at least 50 structures, evidence of a population that might number in the hundreds. But more disturbing still were the sounds carried on the evening breeze, voices speaking not in Apache dialects, but in languages he couldn't identify, punctuated by what sounded unmistakably like English spoken with accents he'd heard before in the mining camps of Colorado. The tall figure began to descend from his rocky perch, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the vertical landscape of the high country. As he approached Joseph's hiding place, details became clearer in the uncertain light of the rising moon. This wasn't an Apache at all, despite the traditional clothing and long hair. The man's features were European, his skin weathered by decades of southwestern sun, but still clearly showing his origins. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured tones of education and authority. "Joseph Running Bear," the stranger said, and Joseph's blood ran cold at hearing his name spoken by someone who should have been a complete stranger. "We've been waiting for you to find us. Your reputation as a tracker is well deserved, but perhaps not for the reasons you believe." The revelation that followed would reshape Joseph's understanding of his own identity and purpose. The man introduced himself as Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, formerly of the geological survey teams that had mapped the Western Territories in the 1860s. But Zimmermann's story was far more complex than simple scientific exploration. He'd discovered something in these mountains that had made him disappear from official records, something that had drawn him to create this hidden community far from the oversight of territorial authorities. "The Apache you've been tracking aren't renegades," Zimmermann explained as he led Joseph down into the settlement. "They're partners in an enterprise that could change the future of the American West, if the right people understood its implications. But that understanding requires trust, and trust requires truth, neither of which are abundant commodities in our current political climate." Walking through the settlement in the moonlight, Joseph observed details that challenged every assumption about frontier life. The Apache residents moved with the confidence of people who were home, not refugees hiding from military pursuit. They worked alongside men and women of obvious European descent, sharing tasks and conversation with an ease that suggested years of cooperation. Children played games that seemed to combine Apache traditions with influences Joseph couldn't identify, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls like music from another world. The central building of the settlement proved to be a combination meeting hall, school, and workshop unlike anything Joseph had seen in his travels across the territory. Maps covered the walls, not the crude sketches common to frontier settlements, but detailed geological surveys that showed mineral deposits, water sources, and topographical features with scientific precision. Tables held samples of or that gleamed in the lamplight, and Joseph's experience with mining camps told him he was looking at wealth beyond imagination. "Silver," Zimmermann said, noting Joseph's examination of the samples. "But not just silver. These mountains contain deposits of precious metals that dwarf anything discovered in Colorado or California. The Apache have known about them for generations, but they've never had the technical knowledge to extract them safely or efficiently. That's where my expertise became valuable to them, and their knowledge of the land became invaluable to me." The partnership that had created this hidden community represented a convergence of interests that challenged every stereotype about Indian and white relations in the territorial period. The Apache provided not just knowledge of the terrain, but sophisticated understanding of seasonal weather patterns, wildlife behavior, and sustainable resource management developed over centuries of living in harmony with the high desert environment. Zimmerman's geological expertise and the scientific knowledge of his European colleagues provided the technical skills necessary to extract and process the mineral wealth without destroying the delicate ecological balance that sustained life in the region. But the true revelation came when Zimmerman led Joseph to a secure building at the heart of the settlement, one guarded by Apache warriors whose weapons and alertness spoke of serious purpose. Inside, Joseph discovered the reason for all the secrecy, the truth that had made this community disappear from the official maps and records of the territorial government. The building contained not just processed silver and gold, but detailed documentation of mineral deposits throughout the Southwest that represented wealth on a scale that could influence national politics. The territorial authorities know something valuable exists in these mountains, Zimmerman explained as Joseph examined ledgers filled with precise geological data. But they don't know exactly what or where. If this information fell into the wrong hands, it could trigger a mining rush that would destroy not just this ecosystem, but every Apache band still living free in the region. More importantly, it could destabilize the delicate balance of power that's kept relative peace in New Mexico for the past decade. Joseph began to understand the true nature of his situation. The Apache raids that had brought him here weren't acts of hostility, but carefully orchestrated operations designed to maintain the fiction that the canyon remained unsettled and unexplored. By taking small amounts of supplies from isolated homesteads, they created the impression of typical raiding activity while actually provisioning a community engaged in mining operations that could have funded their own supply lines through conventional means. The deception was elaborate and sophisticated, requiring coordination between Apache traditionalists who had never accepted reservation life and European scientists who had chosen to disappear from their former lives. But it was also precarious, dependent on maintaining secrecy in an era when territorial expansion and resource exploitation were driving forces in American political policy. Your presence here represents a critical decision point, Zimmerman continued, his voice carrying the weight of years spent building something unprecedented in the American West. You can report back to Colonel Thompson that you lost the Apache Trail in the mountains, allowing this community to continue its work in secret. Or you can reveal our location and watch as both the Apache way of life and our scientific research are destroyed by forces that see only short-term profit in long-term devastation. But Joseph's dilemma was more complex than simple choice between loyalty to military authority and sympathy for Apache survival. His mixed heritage had always made him suspect in the eyes of both communities, trusted by neither side completely despite his proven abilities as a tracker and negotiator. The discovery of this hidden settlement forced him to confront questions about identity and belonging that went far deeper than simple military duty or ethnic loyalty. The Apache residents of the settlement represented something he'd never encountered before: indigenous people who had found a way to adapt to changing conditions without completely abandoning their traditional values and practices. They'd incorporated European technology and scientific knowledge without surrendering their connection to the land or their sense of community identity. For Joseph, who'd spent years navigating between two worlds without fully belonging to either, the settlement represented a potential third path, one that honored both sides of his heritage. As dawn approached over the Sangre de Cristo peaks, painting the canyon walls in brilliant shades of red and gold, Joseph found himself facing the most important decision of his life. The implications extended far beyond his personal circumstances to encompass questions about the future of the American West, the relationship between indigenous peoples and expanding American settlement, and the role of scientific knowledge in resource development and environmental preservation. The weight of the moment was amplified by his growing understanding of what the settlement represented in historical terms. This wasn't just a hidden community or an illegal mining operation. It was a working example of cooperation between cultures that official policy insisted were incompatible. The success of the partnership between Apache traditional knowledge and European scientific expertise suggested possibilities for frontier development that challenged fundamental assumptions about progress, civilization, and the inevitability of conflict between indigenous and settler populations. Standing on the rim of the canyon as morning light revealed the full extent of the settlement below, Joseph realized that his decision would influence not just the fate of the people who'd created this remarkable community, but potentially the entire trajectory of Western expansion and development. The mineral wealth contained in these mountains was significant enough to alter territorial economic conditions, but the methods developed for extracting it sustainably represented innovations that could influence mining practices across the continent. The Apache elder who approached him as he contemplated his choice was a woman whose age was impossible to determine but whose presence commanded immediate respect. She spoke in accented but precise English, her words carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected entire communities. "The mountain has shown you its secret," she said, gesturing toward the settlement spread across the canyon floor. "Now you must decide whether you serve the mountain's wisdom or the ambition of men who see only what they can take from it. Your ancestor spirits from both sides of your family are watching this moment, because your choice will influence the path of generations yet to come." Joseph's response would determine not just his own future, but the fate of an experiment in cross-cultural cooperation that represented one of the most remarkable untold stories of the American frontier. The decision he made as the sun climbed higher over the New Mexico mountains would echo through history, influencing events that wouldn't be fully understood until more than a century later, when historians finally began to piece together the truth about what happened in the hidden canyon where two worlds learned to live as one. The final revelation came in the form of documents that Zimmerman showed him, correspondence with mining engineers and territorial officials that revealed the true extent of government knowledge about mineral deposits in the region. The Apache raids weren't random acts of hostility. They were strategic operations designed to prevent systematic geological surveys that would have revealed the canyon's location and resources. The partnership between Apache knowledge and European science had created not just a successful mining operation, but a sophisticated intelligence network that monitored territorial government activities and influenced policy decisions through carefully orchestrated events. Joseph's tracking skills had brought him to the center of a conspiracy that challenged everything he thought he knew about power, politics, and progress in the American West. His decision in that moment would determine whether the truth remained hidden in the mountains or emerged to reshape understanding of what was possible when different cultures chose cooperation over conflict, wisdom over ambition, and long-term sustainability over short-term profit. The lone wolf had found his pack, but only by choosing to see beyond the surface of what appeared to be an endless cycle of pursuit and evasion between irreconcilable differences. As Joseph stood at the crossroads of history, the weight of generations pressing upon his shoulders, he made the decision that would define not just his own legacy, but the hidden truth of the American West. He turned to Colonel Thompson 3 days later with a report that would become one of the most significant lies ever told to the United States Army. The Apache Trail, he claimed, had vanished into the trackless wilderness of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, lost forever in a maze of canyons and ancient paths that defied even his legendary tracking abilities. But Joseph Running Bear never returned to Fort Union. Instead, he disappeared into the same mountains where he discovered a world that shouldn't have existed, becoming part of the conspiracy that would protect the canyon settlement for decades to come. His military records show him as missing in action, presumed dead while tracking hostile Apache, but the truth was far more extraordinary. For 30 years, Joseph lived and worked in the hidden canyon, using his knowledge of military operations and territorial politics to help maintain the elaborate fiction that kept their community safe from discovery. He married Maria Sandoval, a woman of Spanish and Apache heritage who had been born in the settlement, and together they raised children who grew up speaking 3 languages and understanding that some truths were too dangerous to share with the outside world. The mining operation prospered beyond Zimmerman's wildest projections, generating wealth that funded not just the canyon settlement, but a network of similar communities throughout the Southwest. Apache bands that had supposedly vanished onto reservations were actually thriving in hidden locations where traditional life merged with selective adoption of European technology. The official history of Apache defeat and subjugation was revealed to be largely fiction, maintained by government officials who found it politically convenient to declare victory over a people who had simply chosen to become invisible. When Heinrich Zimmermann died in 1923 at the age of 91, his funeral was attended by 3 generations of Apache and European families who had built lives together in defiance of everything their respective cultures told them was possible. His geological surveys had mapped mineral wealth throughout the region worth hundreds of millions in modern currency. But his true legacy was the proof that cooperation could triumph over conquest when people chose wisdom over warfare. Joseph lived to see the Great Depression devastate communities throughout the American West, while the hidden settlements remained prosperous through carefully managed resource extraction and sustainable agricultural practices developed over decades of trial and refinement. He died in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor brought America into World War II, but not before seeing his grandchildren graduate from universities in Santa Fe and Denver, carrying forward the scientific knowledge and cultural wisdom that had made their extraordinary community possible. The settlement in Cañon Perdido was finally abandoned in 1963, not because of discovery or defeat, but because the children and grandchildren of its founders had integrated so successfully into mainstream American society that maintaining the fiction of its secrecy was no longer necessary. By then, the mineral wealth had been carefully extracted and converted into investments in education, land acquisition, and business enterprises that provided financial security for hundreds of families whose very existence challenged the official narrative of Western expansion. Today, if you know where to look in the Cibola National Forest, you can still find traces of the buildings where Apache traditional knowledge merged with European science to create something unprecedented in American history. The stone foundations remain, slowly being reclaimed by pinyon pine and juniper, while the carefully terraced gardens have returned to native vegetation that still shows the geometric patterns of their original cultivation. But the true legacy of what happened in that hidden canyon lies not in ruins slowly returning to wilderness, but in the descendants of those original settlers who now live throughout the American Southwest. They are teachers and doctors, engineers and artists, business owners and political leaders whose success stories are built on foundations laid by ancestors who chose cooperation over conflict and proved that different worlds could not just coexist, but thrive together. The story of Joseph Running Bear and the settlement at Cañon Perdido remains largely unknown to mainstream American history, preserved primarily in oral traditions and private family records that have never been shared with academic researchers or government historians. But for those who know where to look, the evidence exists in genealogical records, mining claims that were never officially filed, and property deeds that trace back to mysterious sources of wealth that appeared in the early 20th century. At sunset, when golden light still paints the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in brilliant amber, some say you can still see the spirit of the lone wolf who discovered that the greatest treasures are found not in what we take from the earth, but in what we choose to build together. The mountain still keeps its secrets, but for those with eyes to see and hearts to understand, the truth remains hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next generation to discover that some stories are too important to remain buried forever. The Apache understood who truly lived in those mountains, not the spirits of the dead, but the living proof that two worlds could become one when people chose courage over fear, wisdom over prejudice, and hope over the bitter lessons of history that told them such dreams were impossible. In the end, the greatest discovery wasn't silver or gold, but the recognition that humanity's true wealth lies in our capacity to transcend the boundaries that divide us and create something greater than the sum of our separate parts.